When a bully decided to toy with a blind man and his German Shepherd, he thought it was harmless. But arrogance turned into violence, and violence was met with unbreakable loyalty. This wasn't just any dog. It was a trained guardian, a partner who knew how to shield his owner without hesitation. With every stare and every move, the shepherd proved that loyalty can outlast cruelty. Will the bully finally give up or destroy himself trying to win watch until the end? To see, and be sure to like this video and subscribe for more true life stories. The day broke with a clarity that made every color on Maple Street feel sharpened, as though the town had been polished overnight. The sky was an unbroken sheet of blue, the kind that stretched endlessly and invited a man to breathe deeper. The little corner cafe opened its doors to the hum of traffic and the warm chatter of regulars, the bell over the door chiming with each new arrival. In the far corner near the wide window, Daniel Walker sat at his usual spot. His posture was firm but relaxed, his cane resting against the chair leg like an old companion. In front of him, a steaming mug of coffee radiated a comfort he had come to rely on. At his feet lay Ranger, a German Shepherd whose very stillness spoke louder than noise. Ranger did not sprawl lazily the way ordinary pets might. He sat in careful readiness, his paws aligned, his chest lifted, and his gaze sweeping the cafe with quiet authority. Every flick of his ear, every measured breath told a story of a dog who had once lived in a world where hesitation could mean danger. To Daniel, Ranger was more than a guide. He was an extension of his senses, an anchor in a world painted with shadows. Daniel had come to love mornings here, the familiar rhythm of forks clinking, Ruby the waitress laughing softly as she refilled cups, the hiss of the espresso machine punctuating the air. He felt the comfort of routine, the safety of community. And for a moment it felt like this morning would be no different. Ranger shifted slightly, his muscles tightening for only a second before relaxing again. Daniel's hand brushed his head in silent reassurance, a small signal that said, "I know you're there. I trust you." It was then that the cafe's door burst open with a jingle too sharp, followed by the low rumble of voices that didn't belong to the gentle harmony inside. 3 men entered, their heavy boots striking the floor in rhythms that turned heads. Leather jackets creaked as they moved, their presence too loud for the quiet corner. Leading them was Ray, broad-shouldered, his grin sharp with mischief and his eyes searching for attention. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on the German Shepherd by Daniel's side. "That's a big one you've got there," Ray remarked, his voice cutting into the cafe's atmosphere. A few customers looked up from their plates, uneasy but silent. Daniel turned slightly toward the sound, offering his usual polite half-smile. "He's a good one," he said, calm and even. "Keeps me steady." Ray's grin widened, the kind that seeks an audience. He leaned closer, clapping his hands once the sound cracking in the air. Ranger's ears twitched, but the dog didn't move. His eyes locked on Ray, not aggressive, not fearful, simply fixed with the weight of a sentinel. The restraint was so deliberate it startled even those watching from a distance. Some had expected a bark, a snarl, some flare of instinct. Instead, Ranger held still, his discipline creating a silence far heavier than noise. The room felt the tension. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations faltered, and Ruby stopped mid-step, her eyes narrowing at the scene. Ray chuckled, patting his thigh as if coaxing a backyard pet. "Come on, big guy," he teased. Still, Ranger did not move. His presence was immovable, a wall between his handler and the world, his focus unbroken. Daniel, though he could not see the faces around him, felt the change in the air, the shift of weight in the leash, the subtle tremor of tension. His hand rested on Ranger's harness, steady and trusting. "We're fine," he said simply, his voice calm but firm, sending the message as much to the room as to the man hovering too close. The bully's smirk faltered, his pride pricked by the absence of the chaos he had sought. For a brief moment his eyes flicked to the room and found no support, only quiet stares and restrained disapproval. The dog had answered his challenge not with teeth, but with discipline, and that victory was undeniable. The cafe seemed to exhale all at once as Ray stepped back, his laugh thinner than before. Ranger remained still, eyes following him until the space was clear, his body relaxing only when he judged the distance safe. Daniel lifted his coffee, the calm returning to his face, though he knew something unspoken had shifted. Ranger's steady presence was the silent proof danger had brushed past, but the storm was only beginning to gather. Daniel rose from his chair with the patience of a man who had repeated this ritual countless times, his cane in one hand and his other hand brushing Ranger's harness in a gesture that was both casual and deliberate. The cafe air had settled after the strange intrusion, yet a ripple of unease remained, the kind that lingers after thunder even when the sky looks clear. Daniel sensed it in the subtle hush that followed him, in the faint tremor of the leash that spoke of his shepherd's watchful mind. As he turned toward the door, his steps measured and sure, the scrape of boots returned. The same weight of presence pressed near his shoulder, close enough that Daniel could feel the warmth of breath in the space between them. Ray had not truly left. He lingered perhaps outside the cafe, perhaps just beyond the door, and now he had returned with a determination sharper than before. His voice carried a grin but also a stubborn edge. "Careful there, friend," he said, drawing nearer as Daniel oriented himself toward the sidewalk. Before Daniel could respond, the nudge came, deliberate yet soft, a push against his shoulder that was light enough to be excused as a joke, but heavy enough to announce challenge. The cafe hushed again as forks hovered in midair and chairs creaked under shifting weight. Ranger did not hesitate. The shepherd pivoted instantly, his body rising from stillness with the grace of a machine wound tight for action. He stepped into the space between Daniel and Ray, his chest angled outward, his stance firm, his head lifted, his eyes locking on the source of intrusion. No bark, no snap, no reckless leap, just a precise placement of body, as if a line had been drawn in the air that no man would cross. Daniel felt it in the leash, the way the leather pulled taut in a clean arc, the way Ranger's muscles pressed into his leg with intent. He knew without sight that his dog had formed a barrier not of aggression, but of control. The message was unmistakable: this far, no farther. Ray laughed, the sound thinner than before, colored by a hint of unease. He lifted his palms in feigned innocence, tilting his head as though to show he meant no harm, but his eyes betrayed irritation at being checked so swiftly and so calmly. "Easy there," he said, his voice trying to claim casualness, but Ranger's gaze held him. The shepherd did not blink, did not sway, did not retreat. His tail was still, his ears forward, his body language radiating both readiness and restraint. To those watching, it was a performance of discipline unlike any backyard pet. It was the posture of an animal who knew exactly how to respond without wasting a single movement. Daniel steadied his cane, his voice calm but firm. "But that's enough," he said, directing the words into the silence. His tone carried weight, not through volume but through clarity, a man declaring boundary with the confidence of trust in his companion. Around them, the room seemed to lean forward. Ruby's hand hovered over her coffee pot, her eyes never leaving the scene. The young mother pressed her child closer to her side, whispering quiet comfort. The contractor at his table had straightened his jaw, set his fingers drumming lightly as though he was ready to stand if needed. The tension gathered like storm clouds, and all of it centered on the shepherd's steady form. Ray shifted his smirk, faltering under the weight of eyes that were no longer amused but expectant. He had wanted spectacle, had hoped for a bark or a bite he could mock, but instead he was confronted with a living wall that embodied both control and defiance. He glanced toward his friends lingering outside the window, their expressions unreadable, then back at Ranger, whose gaze never left him. The pause stretched long, filled with the sound of Ranger's steady breathing and the faint hum of the radio still trying to keep the morning alive. Finally, Ray stepped back, a half retreat disguised as a casual shift of weight. His laugh came again, but it was hollow, lacking the bravado it once carried. "Relax, we're just playing," he muttered, though no one in the cafe seemed convinced. Ranger eased only when the distance was reclaimed, his body softening a fraction, yet his eyes continuing to track the man until he was fully clear. Daniel felt the leash loosen in his hand, a signal that the line had been restored. He exhaled slowly, letting his composure remain steady. "Come on, Ranger," he said quietly, and the shepherd turned with him, guiding his handler toward the door with measured steps. The cafe exhaled too, a ripple of relief moving through the tables. Ruby called after him softly, "Take care, Mr. Walker," and her tone carried both kindness and concern. The bell above the door jingled as Daniel and Ranger stepped outside, the sunlight spilling over them like a curtain drawn back after a tense scene. On the sidewalk, the air was fresher, the sounds of cars passing and distant conversation reminding Daniel of ordinary life. Yet he could feel in Ranger's stride that the shepherd remained alert, his body still tuned to the possibility of another test. Daniel touched his head gently, a silent thank you, and Ranger's ears flicked in acknowledgement. Behind them, Ray's laughter echoed faintly, more brittle than bold, and though the sound faded with distance, it carried a promise of unfinished business. Daniel lifted his face toward the sun, trusting the calm of the moment, but knowing from Ranger's taut awareness that the morning's disturbance had not been the end. It was only the beginning of something that waited just beyond the horizon. The street outside the cafe was alive with its usual Saturday rhythm, the air full of overlapping conversations, the slam of car doors, and the faint melody of a shop radio drifting through an open window. Daniel walked with his cane confident in each step, because Ranger, his German shepherd, guided him with steady precision. Ranger was not just walking, he was working. His stride was measured, his ears flicking toward every sound, his head lifted as he scanned the world with senses sharpened by training. Daniel inhaled deeply, catching the scents of roasted beans from the cafe behind him and the fresh bread cooling in the bakery across the street, and though he tried to settle into the comfort of the familiar, he could feel the tension in Ranger's leash. The dog's body carried a message Daniel had learned to read. The moment wasn't over. From behind them came the sharp rhythm of boots striking pavement with purpose, and Ranger's ears twitched at once. Then came laughter, louder now, rolling down the row of storefronts with an edge that scraped at the calm. Ray had followed, and his friends shuffled close behind their presence like a shadow pressing against Daniel's back. "Look here, folks." Ray shouted, his voice raised for everyone to hear, a blind man with his big guard dog. "What a sight, huh?" His laughter exploded after the words, exaggerated and theatrical, designed to turn the pair into a spectacle. Heads turned as if on cue. A young couple slowed near a lamppost, curiosity plain on their faces. A father held his son's hand a little tighter as both stopped to watch. Ray thrived on the attention. He threw his arms wide as though taking a stage. His grin fixed his laughter swelling. The show was his, or so he thought. Daniel stopped planting his cane firmly against the sidewalk. He didn't answer the jeer immediately, knowing silence could be stronger than a quick reply. Ranger stepped slightly forward, widening his stance, his chest angled toward the laughter. His body became a shield, steady and present. The dog did not bark or growl. Instead, his stillness was the answer. His eyes locked on Ray, his posture speaking a language clear to anyone watching. There would be no humiliation today. Ray pressed on, unwilling to accept the silence. "Come on, everyone, don't hold back," he said with a grin stretched too wide. "Look at this dog standing like he's carved from stone. Does he think he's still on the police force?" The mockery dripped with intent designed to belittle. The crowd stirred unease rippling through the air. Some exchanged glances, uncertain whether to step in. Near a parked car, a man slid his phone from his pocket first. Subtly, then openly holding it up as the screen glowed and recording began. Ray's eyes caught the motion. For the briefest instant, his grin faltered, his bravado slipping under the weight of being watched. But then he straightened, pride flaring, unwilling to step back in front of his friends and strangers alike. He laughed again, louder, the sound hollow. "Go ahead and film it," he declared, waving toward the phone. "Let everyone see the great watchdog standing guard. Look at him, he hasn't moved an inch. Brave or just too stiff to know better." His words were dressed as humor but rang desperate, trying to turn back a tide that was already moving against him. Ranger remained unmoved, his body unshaken, his eyes locked with the same steady intensity. He was no clown, no prop for ridicule. He was a working dog, a guardian, his silence louder than any bark. Daniel, reading the tension in the leash, rested his hand on Ranger's back, feeling the strength beneath the fur. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but edged with truth. "He moves when he needs to. That's more than I can say for you." The quiet reply cut through the noise. A murmur spread through the crowd. A few nodded, a few whispered words of agreement. Ray's grin slipped again. He tried to laugh, but the sound failed to carry. He gestured widely as though to claim control of the moment, but the power had shifted. Every second the phone stayed raised, every murmur from the crowd stripped away his control. Ranger sensed it too. The shepherd adjusted, pressing closer to Daniel's leg, his body angled perfectly to protect his eyes unblinking. He needed no words. His presence spoke clearly. Ray's friends glanced at each other. Their earlier amusement drained their chuckles, weak and uncertain. Still, Ray leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the dog. "So you're the hero, huh? Let's see how long you last when things get loud." His voice had dropped, meant more for Ranger than the crowd, but it carried, recorded by the waiting phone, etched into the silence. Ranger didn't flinch. His muscles stayed taut, his eyes steady. He answered not with sound, but with control, a refusal to give the reaction Ray craved. Daniel felt the calm resolve at his side, and he gave the command quietly but firmly. "We're moving on." He stepped forward, trusting Ranger to guide. The shepherd obeyed with precision, leading his handler past the bully, their stride unbroken, their dignity intact. The crowd parted, silent but attentive eyes following the pair as they moved. The phone stayed raised, capturing the moment, preserving the truth. Ray remained behind, his laughter gone, his pride bruised, his silence heavier than words. His friends shifted uneasily, then followed, their bravado dimmed. As Daniel and Ranger continued down the street, the hum of ordinary life returned softer, now touched by what had been witnessed. Ranger's posture remained taut, his stride deliberate, his vigilance sharp. Daniel walked beside him, outwardly calm, but inwardly certain of one thing: pride seldom surrenders so easily. He knew from the weight in Ranger's body that this confrontation was far from over. The sidewalk seemed to hold its breath as Daniel and Ranger moved forward, the echo of Ray's strained laughter still clinging to the storefronts. Ranger guided with precision, his head lifted, his gait balanced, his body language sharp with intent. The shepherd did not look like a pet walking home from a cafe. He looked like a sentinel escorting his handler through contested ground. Daniel sensed it, the way the leash stayed taut, the way Ranger's shoulder pressed with weight that spoke of anticipation rather than ease. The crowd that had gathered outside had not fully dispersed. Some lingered near the bakery doors, some loitered by parked cars, curiosity fastening them to the scene. The air felt heavy with expectation, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. Ray, unwilling to fade into the background, pushed through the thin circle of onlookers. His grin returned, wide but brittle, and his voice reached across the sidewalk with deliberate force. "Don't mind us, folks. Just trying to see what makes this dog so special." His tone was playful on the surface, but each syllable carried the bite of challenge. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that Ranger adjusted his stance. The shepherd planted his paws firmly, his chest squared, his eyes locked on Ray with an intensity that was undeniable. He did not lunge, he did not bark. Instead, his gaze bore down on the man with a quiet ferocity, the kind that unsettles even the boldest. Ray faltered for half a second under that stare. It was not the reaction he had expected. A growl, a bark, even a snap of teeth, those he could have twisted into a story to laugh about later. But this silence, this unwavering focus, unsettled him in ways noise never could. The shepherd's eyes held something human in their steadiness, a clarity that pierced through the bravado. Daniel, unaware of the full weight of the stare, kept his composure. His voice, calm and measured, carried across the tension. "That's enough. You should go." The statement was simple, yet its steadiness echoed louder than a shout. Around them the crowd shifted, many nodding subtly, others murmuring agreement. A woman near the curb whispered, "He's right." Her words just loud enough to travel. The respect in the air grew not just for the man who stood unshaken, but for the shepherd who guarded without breaking discipline. Ray chuckled again, though it came out thinner like air escaping a balloon. He shifted his weight, glancing at the raised phone that still recorded, then back to Ranger's eyes, which had not moved once. The shepherd's silence had become unbearable. Ray scratched the back of his neck, trying to project nonchalance, but his gestures betrayed the tension knotting his shoulders. His friends muttered from behind him, restless now that the performance had lost its edge. Daniel adjusted his grip on the cane, not with threat, but with certainty. His other hand rested lightly on Ranger's back, the silent connection grounding both of them. "We're finished here," Daniel said evenly. "Let us pass." The tone was not pleading nor angry, but resolute. The crowd recognized the courage in those words, a man refusing to be drawn into hostility, relying instead on dignity and trust in his companion. Ranger inched forward slightly, his paws silent on the pavement, his body tilting closer to Daniel's leg. He was not provoking, he was preparing should the need arise. The subtle movement only deepened the pressure on Ray. For the first time, Ray looked less like a performer and more like a man cornered by his own pride. The standoff stretched long, measured by the shepherd's steady breathing and the faint buzz of a neon sign in the bakery window. Every second that passed eroded Ray's grip on the moment. Finally, with an exaggerated shrug, he stepped back half a pace, attempting to frame it as his decision rather than defeat. "Relax, no harm done," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. But the crowd did not echo his ease. Their silence was heavy judgment woven into every glance. The man with the phone lowered it only slightly, still ready, still bearing witness. Ranger's eyes followed Ray even as the distance grew unwavering until the man had retreated fully to the edge of the gathering. Daniel exhaled softly, sensing the shift in the leash as Ranger eased a fraction. He nodded once, acknowledging his dog without words. The onlookers began to disperse, some returning to errands, others lingering with quiet admiration. One older gentleman caught Daniel's shoulder gently as he passed. "You handled that with real grace," he said. Daniel inclined his head in thanks, though he knew much of the grace had come from the shepherd at his side. Ranger's posture slowly softened his ears, flicking as the tension in the air began to dissolve, but his eyes never stopped scanning, never stopped reading the spaces around them. Daniel tapped his cane lightly on the ground. "Let's go, Ranger," he murmured, and together they resumed their walk down the block. The crowd faded behind them, but Daniel carried the weight of the moment in his chest. He could not see the eyes that had followed them, but he could feel their respect. More importantly, he could feel Ranger's steady presence guiding him forward, with the quiet assurance of loyalty that no mockery could break. Yet beneath the calm, Daniel sensed it was not over. He knew from the tautness still in Ranger's body that Ray's retreat was temporary, that pride had not surrendered, only paused. The silence of the shepherd had unsettled the bully, but silence often leaves unfinished echoes. The afternoon sun dipped lower, painting Maple Street in long shadows that stretched across storefronts and brick walls. Daniel had returned home briefly after the tense encounter, but routine pulled him back outside. He liked to walk the neighborhood before dinner to stretch his legs and give Ranger time to move freely, and the rhythm of their shared steps often settled his mind. The air carried the scent of cut grass and distant barbecue, ordinary smells of a town winding down into evening. Yet beneath the surface of calm, something stirred that Daniel did not notice. Ranger did. His stride was sure, his ears tilting with each sound, his nose working the currents of the breeze. The shepherd catalogued the street the way a soldier reads terrain, noting shifts and patterns, filtering the harmless from the suspicious. Daniel spoke softly to him, a habit of comfort. "Good pace today, Ranger. Feels like the whole block is slowing down with us." The shepherd's tail gave a faint flick, but his body stayed taut, more alert than relaxed. Down the street, leaning against motorcycles parked in the shadow of a hardware store, Ray and two companions watched. Their laughter was quieter than it had been earlier, no longer the public performance of morning bravado, but there was intent behind their stillness. They waited, following with their eyes as Daniel and his shepherd passed. Ray's jaw tightened when he saw the ease in Daniel's posture, the trust that flowed between man and dog. Pride pricked him again, fueling a new determination. He gestured subtly to his friends, and the trio began moving, not with the bold strides of confrontation, but with the measured caution of men who wanted to see without being seen. Daniel, unaware of the tale, continued his walk along the shaded block. Ranger, however, slowed his pace. The shepherd's ears swiveled back, catching the scrape of boots behind them, the faint metallic jingle of something carried loosely, maybe keys or chains. His nostrils flared at a scent carried on the wind, sharp and oily, unlike the bakery's warmth or the lawn's cut grass. It was unfamiliar, unwelcome. Ranger's body tensed and he halted abruptly. Daniel stopped with him, his cane pausing mid-step. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly. He laid a hand on the harness, feeling the strength coiled under the shepherd's frame. Ranger's eyes fixed on the space behind them. He did not growl or bark. Instead, he stood rigid, signaling with silence. His stance pressed firmly against Daniel's leg weight, shifted just enough to block. The sudden stop made Daniel's brow furrow. He knew Ranger did not pause without reason. Slowly, he turned his head toward the faint echoes behind them. He heard only the ordinary street, a door closing. A car engine idling, a voice calling to a child. But Ranger's body told a different story. Daniel whispered, "Something's there, isn't it?" And though no words came back, the leash tugged faintly, the shepherd's version of an answer. Behind them, Ray slowed as well, caught off guard by the dog's sudden halt. He muttered something low to his friends, frustration threading his voice. He knows one of them said, their own confidence faltering. They lingered at the corner, pretending to check their bikes, but Ranger's head remained angled toward them, eyes, sharp ears, locked. It was not the gaze of chance, it was a warning drawn clear across the distance. Ray shifted his weight, glancing at the crowdless street, realizing there were fewer witnesses here than at the cafe. That emboldened him, but the shepherd's stillness unsettled him just as it had before. Daniel adjusted his grip on the cane, the quiet tension making his chest tighten. "Come on, Ranger," he said softly, though his words carried more question than command. The shepherd didn't move at first, forcing Daniel to recognize the seriousness of his pause. Only after another long moment did Ranger step forward again, guiding Daniel slowly, carefully, as though measuring each footfall. His ears never dropped back into relaxation. His nose kept working, and his eyes flicked over shoulders, alleys, and cars. He was guiding not just through the neighborhood, but through unseen danger. Daniel trusted the signals, even if he couldn't interpret them fully. He felt the leash vibrate faintly, the subtle communication honed through their bond. He whispered again, "I'll follow your lead." Ranger moved deliberately, pausing at intersections longer than usual, sniffing the air with purpose and pressing his body closer to Daniel's leg. The gestures were small but clear. They were not alone. Ray and his companions kept their distance, but every move was tracked by Ranger. The shepherd's sudden stops the tight turns of his head, the press of his body against Daniel's side. Each motion told a story of pursuit. Daniel, though he could not see it, began to feel it too. His ears caught fragments, a laugh cut short. Footsteps matching his pace, then halting when he stopped. The realization chilled him, though his face stayed calm. He spoke softly to Ranger. "We'll stay steady, just steady." The shepherd responded with a firmer pull on the harness, guiding Daniel toward a busier intersection up ahead. The sound of traffic carried from that direction a safer place than the quiet block where shadows stretched long and narrow. The dog's instincts told him where safety lay, and Daniel let himself be led each step a pact of trust. Ray's friends muttered again as they watched the pair head toward livelier ground. "Let it go," one said, but Ray's pride clenched his jaw shut. His eyes burned with frustration at being anticipated, outmaneuvered not by the man but by the dog. Ranger's sudden halt had turned the tables, exposing their pursuit before it could unfold. For the second time that day, silence and discipline had robbed him of control. Daniel, feeling the change in Ranger's pace as they neared the intersection, exhaled slowly. He didn't know the details, but he knew enough Ranger had read the danger long before he did. The shepherd's signal had spoken volumes without a single sound. Together they crossed into the busier street, the crowd and traffic weaving around them, and Daniel felt the tightness in his chest ease. Still, he kept one hand steady on Ranger's back, trusting the dog's vigilance more than anything else. Behind them, the motorcycles gleamed in the fading light, their riders left standing in the lengthening shadows. The moment to strike had passed, but the tension had not. Ranger knew it. Daniel felt it. The day had not yet closed its account. Night fell gently over the neighborhood, washing the streets in a silver hue under the glow of street lamps. Daniel sat in his small living room, the television playing faintly in the background, though he paid little attention. The sounds of the evening had always comforted him, the soft hum of appliances, the creak of pipes as the building settled, the distant laughter of neighbors enjoying the cool air on their porches. Ranger rested nearby, stretched out but alert in the way only a German shepherd could be, his head resting on his paws, yet his ears flicking at every change in sound. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hand absently resting on the dog's back, drawing reassurance from the steady rhythm of breath beneath his fingers. He wanted to believe the unease of the afternoon had passed, that the encounter on Maple Street was only a memory fading into the night. But Ranger's posture told him otherwise. The shepherd rose suddenly, padding to the front door with quiet precision. He stood still, his head tilted slightly, his ears pricked toward the hall. Daniel straightened in his chair. "What is it?" "Ranger?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with awareness. He heard nothing at first, only the familiar creaks of the building, the soft hum of the fridge, the faint noise of the television. Yet Ranger's body stiffened his stance, shifting into that firm readiness Daniel had learned to trust without question. Seconds later, the faintest sound reached Daniel's ears, a metallic scrape, delicate but deliberate against the front door. His breath caught and his hand found the armrest, gripping tighter. It wasn't the sound of a key turning, but something smaller, sharper testing. Ranger let out a low growl deep in his chest, barely audible but resonant enough to vibrate against the wood of the door. It wasn't the kind of sound that invited panic. It was measured, restrained, a warning meant for the intruder rather than his master. Daniel whispered, "I hear it now." His voice almost lost to the hum of the television. He stood carefully, his cane in one hand, reaching out with the other until he touched the harness. Ranger stood firmly in front of him, a wall of muscle and discipline, his eyes locked on the door. The growl rumbled again, steady, unbroken. Outside, footsteps shifted on the landing. The metallic scraping stopped, replaced by a slow drag along the wood of the door, as though fingernails or maybe metal tested the surface for weakness. Daniel's pulse quickened. He had no sight to confirm what he felt, but Ranger's reaction told him enough. The intruder was not simply passing through. He was testing, probing, looking for a way in. The shepherd pressed closer to the door, his tail stiff, his body angled forward. The growl deepened for a moment, then cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. Silence heavier than noise. Daniel could feel his own chest rise and fall slower now as he fought for calm. He crouched slightly, resting his hand on Ranger's shoulder. "We're all right," he whispered, though he knew the words were as much for himself as for the dog. Ranger's body was solid under his hand, unwavering, ready. A soft thud sounded against the door, as though someone pressed a palm flat against it, testing weight, measuring resistance. Ranger's lips curled slightly, the faint baring of teeth, but he did not bark. He had been trained to control, to measure threat with precision. The intruder would know the dog was there, would feel the warning and the vibrations of that low growl, but Daniel would not be thrown into panic by sudden barking. Minutes stretched long. The faint scuff of boots shifted outside, pacing, retreating a step, then returning. Ranger tracked each sound with the tilt of his head, the movement of his shoulders. Daniel held the cane steady, his knuckles white. He listened, every sense sharpened by tension. Then, slowly the noises faded down the hall, the scuff of boots descending stairs, the creak of the building absorbing the sound, until silence returned. Ranger remained in position, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the door, as though he could still see the figure lingering just beyond sight. Daniel exhaled, loosening his grip on the cane. "Good boy," he said softly, stroking the shepherd's fur. The dog did not relax fully. He stood firm, his body a barrier, his gaze locked on the door for long minutes after the noises had gone. Only when the night had truly quieted did Ranger step back, returning to Daniel's side, though his ears never settled completely. Daniel sank into his chair, the weight of realization heavy in his chest. His home, once his refuge, no longer felt untouchable. The intruder had crossed a boundary tonight. Testing the lock was more than mischief, it was intent. Ranger had caught it first, had stood between him and the unseen danger, had measured his response with the precision of a seasoned guardian. But Daniel knew this was not the end. The scrape of metal on his door still echoed in his mind, the sound of a threat that would return. He reached for the phone on the side table, his fingers brushing its familiar shape. He didn't call yet. Instead, he let his hand rest there, a quiet promise to himself that he would be ready if the sound came again. Ranger settled at his feet, head resting, but eyes open, his body still coiled. The man and the dog shared the silence, each aware that the night had changed the shape of safety. Outside, the street lamp flickered once, casting a long shadow across the pavement, as if the night itself acknowledged the unease now woven into the quiet block. The night deepened heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of traffic in the distance and the occasional bark of a dog 2 streets over. Daniel sat in his living room with the lamp casting a soft glow across the worn rug, the television still playing in the background, though the sound was turned low. Ranger lay close to him, his head on his paws, but his ears remained restless, turning at every sound as if testing the weight of the night. The scrape on the lock earlier still echoed in Daniel's mind, a warning he couldn't shake. He tried to read the rhythm of Ranger's breathing for comfort, but even that was tight, shallow, the pattern of a dog half at rest, half waiting. It came again, sharper this time. A sudden metallic grind against the front door, not cautious like before, but urgent, deliberate. Daniel froze in his chair, his ears straining. The sound was different now, heavier, accompanied by the faint thud of something striking against the frame. He whispered Ranger, though he didn't need to. The shepherd was already on his feet, his body rigid, his eyes burning toward the door. Then came the unmistakable creak of metal prying against wood, the sound of a crowbar forcing itself into the seam of the lock. Daniel's chest tightened. This was no longer a test. This was an attempt. Ranger moved without hesitation. He bounded to the door, But instead of lunging or barking, he did something Daniel had never trained him to do, but that instinct and discipline seemed to guide. The shepherd angled his body against a wooden chair that sat beside the door and pushed his muscles straining as he wedged it tight under the handle. The chair scraped against the floor with a sharp groan, the sound echoing through the apartment. Daniel understood at once what his dog was doing, buying time. "Good boy." Daniel whispered, his voice trembling but steady enough. He reached for the phone on the table, his fingers fumbling before finding the familiar shape. He dialed, pressing it to his ear, his heart pounding as Ranger pressed his weight harder against the door. Outside, the crowbar screeched again, metal grinding into wood, the door shuddering with each attempt. The low growl came from Ranger's chest, vibrating through the apartment, a sound controlled yet forceful, sending a clear message through the barrier of wood and steel. The dispatcher's voice answered calm and practiced. Daniel forced the words out quickly, his voice low. "This is Daniel Walker. I live on Birchwood Lane. Someone's at my door. They're trying to break in. My dog's holding them off, but I need officers here now." He heard the dispatcher respond, assuring him help was on the way, instructing him to stay on the line. He clutched the phone tighter, his other hand brushing Ranger's back, feeling the strength coiled there. The door jolted again under the pressure of the crowbar. Ranger's body pushed harder into the chair. His paws braced his muscles, taut like cables. Daniel whispered encouragement, each word steady despite the fear that gripped him. "Hold it, Ranger. Just hold." The shepherd growled again, deeper this time, the sound resonating through the wood. Outside, a curse muffled under breath, then more force, the crowbar striking with desperation. But Ranger did not give way. The chair held firm under his weight, each scrape of wood against tile another second earned. The dispatcher's voice came through the line again, firm. "Officers are on the way. Stay inside. Keep the dog steady." Daniel nodded, though no one could see. He crouched low, staying near Ranger, feeling the vibration of every impact against the door. His hand found the shepherd's shoulder, solid and unmoving. He whispered, "You're saving me, Ranger." The pounding at the door continued for long, dragging minutes, then began to falter. The low growl from Ranger grew louder, as if challenging the intruder directly through the barrier. Then suddenly, the noise outside shifted. The crowbar clattered against the ground and hurried footsteps retreated down the stairwell. Ranger held his ground ears, fixed eyes burning at the door, refusing to move until the last sound of boots faded into the night. Only then did his growl soften into silence. Though his body remained tense, the chair still pressed under his weight. Daniel kept the phone to his ear, breath trembling as he spoke. They ran. "I think they're gone, but please hurry." The dispatcher assured him that officers were only moments away. Daniel let the words settle, his hand still pressed against Ranger's back, the dog's body steady as stone. The shepherd had done more than defend. He had anticipated, acted with a mind sharpened by loyalty and training. Minutes later, the red and blue lights washed against the curtains, flashing across the dim room. A knock came firm, but measured. "Police," a voice called. Ranger glanced back at Daniel, waiting for permission. Daniel gave a quiet signal, and the dog stepped aside, though his eyes never left the door until Daniel opened it. Officers entered, their flashlights sweeping over the frame, pausing at the marks gouged deep into the wood, the bent metal of the lock. One officer crouched to examine the damage, shaking his head. "They were serious," he said. Another officer looked at Ranger, whose chest still rose and fell with readiness, and nodded with respect. "Good dog," he said simply. Daniel explained as best he could, his words steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He told them about the crowbar, the sound of boots, the way Ranger had held the line. The officers took notes, promised to patrol the area through the night, and advised Daniel to reinforce the lock in the morning. When they left, the apartment was quiet again, the lamplight steady, but the weight of what had happened pressed heavy in the air. Daniel lowered himself back into the chair, exhausted but grateful, his hand stroking Ranger's fur. "You gave me time. he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Ranger pressed closer, resting his head against Daniel's knee, his eyes still trained on the door as though daring anyone to return. Daniel exhaled, leaning back, knowing the night had changed everything. Home had been breached, if not in body, then in intent. The shepherd's actions had held the line, but Daniel understood this was only the beginning of something larger. The sound of boots fading into the night was not the end. It was a promise of return. The flashing lights outside Daniel's apartment spilled streaks of red and blue across the walls, mixing with the lamplight that had seemed so steady only minutes before. 2 officers were inside taking notes, their voices calm and deliberate. Ranger sat by the door, his body angled forward, ears twitching at every sound from the stairwell. He had not relaxed since the crowbar scraped against the lock. One officer crouched to examine the gouges in the wood, while the other asked Daniel to recount everything he had heard. Daniel's voice was steady, though edged with fatigue. He explained how the sound began, how Ranger had pressed against the chair to hold the door, and how the intruder fled only moments before the patrol arrived. The officer nodded, writing swiftly, then asked if Daniel felt certain it was the same man who had harassed him earlier that day. Daniel hesitated, but gave a quiet yes, trusting Ranger's reaction as proof enough. Ranger shifted suddenly, his nose lifting, pulling the leash tight in Daniel's hand. His head swung toward the door, his body alert. Daniel felt the tension ripple through the harness and frowned. "What is it, Ranger?" he asked, though the dog had already made his decision. Without warning, Ranger pressed against the doorframe and let out a sharp sniff, a sound that drew both officers' attention. He growled once low and purposeful, then pulled toward the hallway. One officer stepped quickly to the door, motioning for the other to follow. Ranger guided Daniel forward, his nose close to the ground, inhaling with intensity. The officers exchanged a look, then allowed the dog to lead, their flashlights cutting into the stairwell. The scent trail was invisible to Daniel, but to Ranger it was a vivid map, fresh and undeniable. He moved with focus, each step certain pulling Daniel along with firm precision. The shepherd's path drew them down the stairs, past the front lobby, and out into the night air. The street was quiet, but Ranger did not falter. He tugged left toward the side alley that ran behind the building. His body grew taut, his tail stiff, his paws deliberate on the cracked pavement. Daniel could feel it in his grip. Ranger had locked onto the trail. The officers followed close, their lights bouncing against brick walls, their hands near their holsters. One whispered, "He's tracking," and the other nodded, trusting the shepherd's instincts. Ranger pulled Daniel into the narrow alley where shadows stretched long and uneven. The smell of oil and damp concrete lingered, but under it was something sharper, sweat leather, the faint tang of metal. Ranger halted suddenly, his body frozen, ears forward, chest rumbling with a low growl. Daniel stiffened beside him, holding the cane tight. The officer's lights swept across the alley, illuminating fresh scuff marks along the wall and a cigarette still smoldering near the dumpster. One officer bent quickly to examine it. "He was just here," he muttered. Ranger sniffed again, then pushed a step forward, his head turning toward the far end of the alley. Daniel could feel the decision in the leash. The man had fled this way only moments ahead. The officers raised their beams higher, revealing the chain-link fence at the alley's end, the top still rattling from recent movement. "He scaled it," one officer said. The dog barked once, sharp and commanding. His nose pressed toward the fence, confirming the truth. Daniel stroked Ranger's head, whispering, "You've got him, boy." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions tight. One keyed his radio, reporting the pursuit direction, calling for additional patrols in the surrounding blocks. The other turned back to Daniel, his voice steady but heavy. "Walker, this isn't the first time we've dealt with this man. He's been involved in assaults, intimidation, and worse. He's not just a nuisance, he's dangerous. He won't let this go easily." Daniel's chest tightened. He already knew from Ranger's vigilance that the threat wasn't over, but hearing it spoken aloud carved it deeper. He nodded slowly, his hand still firm on Ranger's harness. "Then we'll be ready," he said quietly. Ranger pressed close to his leg, his breathing steady but his body still alert, his eyes fixed on the direction the intruder had fled. The officers guided Daniel back toward the apartment, promising they would keep patrol cars circling through the night, advising him to replace the lock immediately and to keep his phone nearby. Daniel listened, memorizing every instruction, but he also felt the truth in the steady pulse of the leash in his hand. The real defense stood beside him, 4 legs grounded in loyalty, instincts sharpened by training. Back inside, the officers made their final notes and assured him again that they would increase surveillance. Ranger lay near the door, but his body did not relax. His nose twitched at every whisper of air from the hall, his chest rising and falling with controlled breath, his eyes never straying from the entrance. Daniel lowered himself into his chair, running a hand along the shepherd's back. "You tracked him," he whispered. "Before I even knew you had him cornered in that alley. You're the reason we're safe." The television still played in the background, the ordinary sound of a world that continued, but Daniel knew his home was no longer ordinary ground. The door bore the marks of violence. The officer's warning echoed in his ears, and Ranger's posture told him the fight was far from finished. He reached for the phone on the table again, not to dial this time, but to set it close by where his hand could find it in an instant. Ranger lifted his head at the movement, his eyes meeting Daniel's unseen gaze with a certainty that required no words. Outside, the night stretched on the flicker of street lamps, casting restless shadows along the block. Somewhere beyond them, Ray carried his pride like a weapon, and Daniel understood the truth. This was not over. The danger would return, and when it did, Ranger would be ready. The days following the attempted break-in passed with a tension that clung to Daniel's apartment like a second skin. He replaced the damaged lock, the police kept their word with extra patrols, and neighbors checked in with food and kind words. Yet Ranger never truly relaxed. Even in sleep, his ears twitched at the smallest noise, his body angled toward the door as though waiting for the next test. Daniel recognized the signs. His shepherd was telling him that danger had not drifted away. It was circling, waiting for another opening. When Saturday arrived, Daniel decided to take his usual route to the town square. He didn't want fear to cage him inside, and Ranger's steady companionship gave him the courage to step into the flow of ordinary life again. The square was alive with chatter children laughing near a fountain, and the scents of roasted peanuts and fresh coffee drifting from nearby stands. The liveliness of the crowd wrapped Daniel in a sense of safety, yet Ranger remained taut beside him, guiding with precision, his head high, his eyes working tirelessly. Daniel found a bench near the fountain and sat enjoying the sound of water splashing and people moving around him. He reached down to pat Ranger's head. "We're fine here," he said softly. Ranger flicked an ear but did not ease his posture. His gaze swept the crowd, his muscles coiled his tail still. Then, out of the buzz of voices, a familiar tone cut through, forced, casual, but unmistakable. "Hey, Walker." Daniel stiffened his hand, tightening on the leash. Ranger bristled immediately, his body leaning forward, his eyes locking onto the source. Ray was there, his boots striking against the stone path, his jacket slung over his shoulder, as though he had come only to blend into the square. His voice was smoother than before practiced, rehearsed. "I came to make things right," he said loud enough for nearby ears to catch. Several people turned their conversations, pausing. Ray raised his hands slightly, palms open, a show of harmlessness. "I pushed too far the other day. Got carried away. I want to apologize." His tone dripped with sincerity, but the words didn't sit well in the air. Daniel tilted his head toward the voice, his own voice steady but cautious. "An apology doesn't erase what happened." Ranger pressed closer to Daniel's leg, his chest low, his eyes never leaving Ray. The shepherd did not believe in apologies crafted for show. His body said so. Ray stepped closer, still smiling. His voice, lowered now, meant for Daniel more than the crowd. "You don't need to be afraid. I'm here to put it behind us." He extended his hand as though to shake. Ranger's ears snapped forward, his body tightening like a drawn bow. Daniel felt the change instantly through the leash, the pulse of tension that told him something was wrong. He murmured, "Easy, Ranger," but the dog did not ease. His instincts screamed louder than the man's gentle words. The crowd around them watched, curious, uncertain. A young woman near the fountain lifted her phone recording. Ray's grin wavered at the sight, but pride pushed him on. He stepped suddenly quick as a strike lunging toward Daniel's shoulder as if to seize him. Gasps erupted from the crowd. But before Ray's hand could close the distance, Ranger moved. The shepherd surged forward with explosive precision, planting himself squarely between Daniel and the man. His body hit with controlled force, not teeth but muscle, a shove that knocked Ray off balance and sent him stumbling back against the edge of the fountain. Ranger stood rigid, his eyes blazing, his chest rumbling with a growl sharp enough to freeze the square. Daniel's heart pounded as he gripped the leash. He hadn't seen the move, but he felt it all the sudden surge, the impact, the vibration of loyalty through leather. The crowd erupted in voices, some calling for calm, others crying out at Ray's sudden aggression. The young woman's phone caught everything. The false apology, the sudden lunge, the shepherd's immediate shield. Ray scrambled to his feet, his face twisted between anger and the weight of dozens of eyes judging him. He lifted his hands again, pretending innocence, but the recording had already betrayed him. Daniel stood slowly leaning on his cane, his voice steady. "That's not how peace looks," he said, his words carrying more weight than volume. Ranger stood unyielding at his side, still pressed forward, his growl steady. The people gathered closer, their murmurs swelling into open disapproval. One man called out, "We saw what you did. Leave him alone." Another added, "The dog saved him." Again. Ray looked around, the trap of his own making closing tighter. The apology had turned into an ambush, and the ambush had collapsed under the weight of truth. Ranger gave one last growl before stepping back, returning to Daniel's side, his body still ready if another move came. Daniel stroked his head softly, calming him, though he knew the shepherd's instincts had been right all along. Ray muttered something under his breath, then turned sharply, retreating through the crowd. The people parted not with respect, but with disdain, their eyes cold as they watched him go. Phones were raised, faces recorded, and the lie of reconciliation had been laid bare. Daniel sat again slowly, his chest heavy with adrenaline. He leaned down to Ranger and whispered, "You knew. You always know." Ranger pressed his head lightly against Daniel's leg, his eyes still fixed on the path Ray had taken. The fountain's water splashed again, filling the silence left behind. Yet Daniel understood this wasn't over. The failed ambush meant only one thing. Ray's pride had taken another wound, and wounded pride is dangerous. The square still buzzed with tension after Ray's false apology collapsed under the shepherd's quick defense. Daniel sat quietly on the bench, one hand on Ranger's back, the other steady on his cane, his breath finally slowing from the shock of the attempted lunge. Ranger stood firm, body taut, eyes locked on the path Ray had taken, as if expecting his return. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it grew larger, drawn by the commotion. Phones raised voices whispering judgment heavy in the air. Children clung to their parents. People shook their heads, and the story was already spreading with every recorded second captured on glowing screens. Daniel leaned toward Ranger, whispering, "He won't give up this easily," and the shepherd pressed closer. His silence a confirmation. Then, as though summoned by the words, Ray broke through the outer ring of the crowd once more. His chest heaved, his eyes wild with desperation, his pride shattered and clawing for a final chance. He no longer wore the mask of apology. His posture carried only defiance. The murmurs swelled into gasps as he rushed forward faster than before, arms outstretched toward Daniel. Enough of this, he shouted, but his words were swallowed by the collective intake of breath around him. Daniel braced his hand, tightening on the harness, but Ranger had already moved. The shepherd launched upward with the power of a trained guardian, intercepting the charge in a single, controlled motion. His body struck Ray squarely, not with teeth, but with sheer force, the impact sending the man sprawling backward onto the stone pavement. Ranger followed immediately, planting his paws firmly on Ray's chest, pinning him to the ground. His growl vibrated low and steady, not the frenzy of an attack, but the warning of command. Ray flailed, struggling beneath the dog's weight, but Ranger adjusted with practiced precision, leaning his body forward just enough to keep him down without crossing into savagery. The shepherd's restraint was as clear as his power. The crowd erupted in a chorus of voices. Some shouted for police, others cried encouragement to the dog, but all of them recognized the truth of what they were witnessing. A man who had harassed, threatened, and deceived was now held powerless by the very animal he had mocked. Daniel rose slowly from the bench, guided by the leash that pulsed with Ranger's strength. His voice carried calm authority, each word deliberate. "Stay down. He won't hurt you unless you give him reason." His tone was steady, even as adrenaline raced through him, and his dignity struck the crowd with quiet force. Phones captured every angle. A young man ran to the fountain and dialed 911, shouting into the receiver. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her voice loud and certain. "We all saw it. He attacked first. The dog only protected." The words carried across the square, echoed by others, nodding, speaking in agreement. The tide had turned fully, the bully's last attempt undone by the clarity of truth and the unwavering discipline of a shepherd who knew exactly how to act. Ray's protests faltered under the weight of the crowd. His words were lost in the rising chorus of disapproval, his arms pinned by Ranger's stance. The shepherd's eyes never left him, dark and unyielding, reading every twitch of movement with the calculation of instinct sharpened by training. Daniel placed a hand gently on the dog's back, signaling calm. "Hold him, Ranger," he murmured, and the shepherd obeyed his weight, steady, his growl soft but constant. Minutes stretched. Then the wail of sirens approached, cutting through the noise of the square. The crowd parted, making way for officers who hurried forward, their eyes widening at the sight. They took in the scene quickly. The man pinned the dog, poised but disciplined, the crowd pointing in unison. Two officers knelt to restrain Ray, ordering him to keep still as they secured his arms. Only when Daniel gave the signal did Ranger step back, returning to his handler's side, his body still ready should the man break free. The officers pulled Ray to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation as voices from the crowd rained down disapproval, condemnation, and truth. Daniel stood with quiet composure, one hand on Ranger's harness, the other gripping his cane. The officer nearest him nodded with respect. "Your dog did exactly what he should. Held the line without crossing it. That takes more discipline than most people realize." Daniel gave a small smile, stroking Ranger's head. He knows what matters. Around them, the crowd began to applaud, not loud or raucous, but steady, a rhythm of approval for the man and the dog who had faced down cruelty with dignity and loyalty. Phones' lowered voices softened, and neighbors exchanged words that would spread quickly, stories of courage, of a shepherd's unshakable loyalty, of justice made visible. Ray, cuffed and defeated, stood silent, now his pride broken under the weight of judgment he could no longer outrun. The officers led him away through the crowd, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffle. Ranger watched until the man disappeared from sight, then finally eased his body, settling though his eyes still scanned, unwilling to relax fully until he was sure the danger had truly passed. Daniel exhaled, his hand resting on the dog's back. "You did it," he whispered. Ranger looked up, his gaze calm, his breathing steady. Together they turned back toward the bench, the square slowly resuming its rhythm, though touched now with the memory of what had unfolded. Daniel knew the road ahead would still hold shadows, but with Ranger beside him, those shadows would never overcome the light of loyalty and trust. In the end, it wasn't strength or anger that won, it was loyalty, discipline, and the courage of a dog protecting the man he loved. Do you agree that the crowd made the right choice standing with them? Leave your opinion in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more, and join us next time for another powerful story.